And we begin today with the great privilege of having with us the president of the United Methodist Council of Bishops around the world, a friend of ours, Bishop Thomas Bickerton from New York. Bishop Bickerton has the unenviable position of leading the church through all of its difficulties, but also the enviable position of leading the church into a new day. And so we're grateful. We know that, Bishop, you have been a leader in our denomination for years. But some people, they may have already forgotten. But others of us will never forget how you led the Imagine campaign that combated malaria and raised, I believe, nearly $10 million from our denomination in one of the greatest displays of the church at its best. Your leadership internationally, fighting poverty and hunger and disease, malaria, HIV, and AIDS is truly appreciated. We hope that the United Methodist Church might again recover its deep sense of mission and ministry to all people. And you have led us in a way that no other bishop has ever been able to do. And so we're grateful for you at this time. Your recent speech to the Council of Bishops needs repeating in various ways. And today we've invited you to speak to us about pivoting United Methodism toward a hope-filled future. Bishop Bickerton, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Messer and Dr. Martz and members of the team for putting together this event. It's always a great joy to be with you, and I greatly appreciate the chance to be back with you today. I want to center my remarks in these next few moments on an adaptation of that Council of Bishops speech that I gave. And so I want to talk a little bit this morning about looking back, looking around, and looking ahead for a hope-filled future as United Methodists. A few months ago, I was invited to deliver a speech on building a beloved community. I'm a bit of a wordsmith, so in preparing for that speech, I pulled up good old Webster's dictionary to find the definition of the word beloved. Not surprisingly, Webster's offers a very simple definition. Beloved means dearly loved or dear to the heart. The phrase or idea of beloved community was first used in the late 19th and early 20th century by the philosopher theologian Josiah Royce as a part of his founding of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. It was then popularized by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. As I researched this phrase further, I discovered that there were 5 defining characteristics of a beloved community. 1, a shared desire to be peaceful, happy, and safe. 2, a recognition that while conflict still exists, it's resolved peacefully, non-violently, and without hostility, ill will, or resentment. 3, in the beloved community, there's a recognition of the inherent worth and value of all people, animals, and ecosystems. 4, a beloved community is motivated by unconditional and all-inclusive kindness, compassion, and love for all life. To that end, a beloved community works cooperatively to peacefully end hunger, prejudice, poverty, homelessness, environmental destruction, and violence and injustice of all kinds. And 5thly, in a beloved community, the means we use to create change are just as kind and compassionate as the ends that we seek. Now, interestingly enough, while I was doing my research on this concept of beloved community, I was simultaneously working on a speech on the events leading up to the split of the church over slavery during the Civil War. As we all know, one of the most volatile periods of time in history of the United States is that period in the mid-1800s when this country literally divided over the issue of slavery. The value of oppressing a race of people in order to further the economy of the privileged outweighed the value of loving everyone as our neighbor in the gospel message. And as a result, we were immersed in a civil war. It became so toxic that siblings often fought against siblings in border states, homes were divided, battle lines were drawn, accusations were made, and as a result, division took place in every aspect of life, including the places where we worshiped. That lack of unity found its way into the Methodist Episcopal Church, and in 1844, it led to the formation of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It was territorial, culturally driven, and oppositional in spirit. It was anything but a model for beloved community. I'm a collector of old books of discipline. Some would call that a sick behavior, especially given the recent ineffectiveness of the gatherings that create those books. But still, in my work as a bishop, other than the Bible, it's the book that I'm expected to know the most about. I jokingly say to my pastors that I know that they keep a copy of the discipline on their nightstand and engage in reading it every night before they go to bed. To do my research on the church split piece, I turned to a copy of the 1860 Book of Discipline. Now, this particular copy that I have in my possession was owned by a gentleman by the name of H.J. Taylor. In fact, almost every book of discipline I have in my collection is signed by someone, and I found that often those someones are laypersons. I've discovered that these little books of discipline were signed by laity because, in fact, they were kept by their bedside and were indeed read with regularity. Those little books of discipline often stated that the primary responsibility of a United Methodist was to know the scriptures, and the secondary responsibility was to know their book of discipline. The reason? The 2016 Book of Discipline is a book of rules. The 1860 Book of Discipline was a book of conduct. The 2016 Book of Discipline is a result of legislation. The 1860 Book of Discipline called Methodists to a lifestyle. On page 67 of the 1860 Book of Discipline, there is section number 4 entitled The Necessity of Union Among Ourselves. Now, keep in mind that this is in the midst of the Civil War and right in the middle of a major church split. Also, keep in mind that at some point, these disciplines were removed from the Book of Discipline as being either unnecessary, irrelevant, or incompatible with a book that had become filled with rules and legislation. But right in the middle of chaos, uncertainty, and discord, the Methodist Book of Discipline has a section entitled The Necessity of Union Among Ourselves. Now, listen to what it says, quote, "Let us be deeply sensible from what we have known of the evil of a division in principle, spirit, or practice, and the dreadful consequences to ourselves and others. If we are united, what can stand before us? If we divide, we shall destroy ourselves, the work of God, and the souls of our people." Question: what can be done in order to achieve a closer union with each other? Answer: 1, let us be deeply convinced of the absolute necessity of it. 2, pray earnestly for and speak freely to each other. 3, when we meet, let us never part without prayer. 4, take great care not to despise each other's gifts. 5, never speak lightly of each other. 6, let us defend each other's character in everything so far as is consistent with the truth. 7, labor in honor, each to prefer the other before himself. And 8, we recommend a serious perusal of the book the causes, evils, and cures of heart and church division. Now, there it is, right in the middle of a book of discipline. There it is, the essence of what it means to be in love and charity with one another. The call is to be sensible and aware of the evil around us and the consequences of it. The reality stated is simple yet profound. If we are united, we're strong. But if we're divided, we will destroy ourselves, kill the work of God we've been called to, and do harm to vulnerable souls. This little 1860 book of discipline, in a very simple form, gives some very strong words of direction. Convince yourself of the absolute need for unity. Pray for one another. Talk to, not at, one another. Pray before you leave. Don't despise one another. Don't speak lightly of one another. Defend one another's character and work hard so that you value someone else before yourself. The theme about how to find unity among ourselves is simple. You've got to love your neighbor. It's all about honoring gifts, valuing relationship, seeing the good in one another, and seeking God's presence to remind you of it when you stray away. It's why this same little book admonishes preachers in a section about how they are to conduct themselves, that the primary function of a preacher is to do nothing but save souls. It's about someone else, always about someone else. Now, doesn't that sound like the components of the beloved community? A shared desire to be peaceful, happy, and safe. Conflict is resolved peacefully without ill will or resentment. We're motivated by kindness, compassion, and love for all. Peace isn't just something that happens. It has to be a desire. Happiness these days seems so far gone, but it can only be revived when we find joy in one another. Now, as we look back, this section of the 1860 Book of Discipline, along with other sections on the conduct of clergy, laity, and congregations, that section was found in every edition of the Book of Discipline from 1784 until 1939. In 1939, the General Conference that established the Methodist Church through merger eliminated all of these sections from our Book of Discipline. This General Conference, known most especially for the formation of the racist-driven central jurisdiction, also removed every section related to how Methodism was to conduct itself as a movement. There was a recognition that the frontier was being replaced with buildings, the circuit rider was being replaced with educated pastors, and the movement was being replaced by an institution. In 1939, the process began to unfold, which made our Methodist Book of Discipline a rule book of laws and legislation rather than a book about the discipline needed to maintain the Spirit of Christ within and the mission to serve throughout. In 1968, this work to institutionalize the church continued in the next merger. Agencies were created, norms were established, compromises were made. And I would argue that 56 years later, we are working harder to preserve the institution and the structure that was created to preserve that institution than we are the missional spirit that will provide the basis upon which our theology can find life and application. It's not so very hard, friends, and it doesn't take very long to realize that our world is immersed in a real struggle right now. I was really blessed a few months ago to share a meal with former President of the United States, Bill Clinton. In that conversation, Mr. Clinton looked at me and said, "I'd like your opinion on what you think we should be doing to correct the imbalance in our world today." You see, he said, the real problem is that we've stopped talking with one another and instead are only talking at one another. I couldn't agree more. We've digressed into the my way or the highway mentality, where if you don't agree with my opinion or my position, you're just wrong. Whether it's the differences across state lines, party lines, or lines drawn in the sand in the halls of Congress or the US Senate, we've stopped working for the country and started working for the party, stopped working for the common good and started working for the next campaign. And as a result, probably find ourselves closer to some form of a civil war than we have since the last one ended in the 1860s. And sadly enough, those same polarizing attitudes and cultural shifts have found their way into our beloved church. Sadly, the decline of our church has been a result of a de-emphasis on our even evangelistic mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, and an overemphasis on the inevitable polarization caused by trying to determine whether you're a traditionalist, a centrist, or a progressive. Rather than celebrating diversity as a gift, we placed one another in silos of prejudiced categories that set us all up to fail instead of embracing the time-honored spirit of connectionalism that once proudly said we are stronger together than we are apart. And so before we've known what's happened to us, our church looks more like the culture than the culture looks like the church. And as a result, we look like anything but a beloved community. Our church is immersed in a period that's not only unprecedented in our church's history, but it's unprecedented in our lifetimes. Our work is consumed with words like disaffiliation, separation, COVID fallout, declining sustainability, and growing irrelevance. The entrepreneurial spirit that led early Methodist circuit riders to the edge of the frontier has been replaced with a preservationist mentality that worships the padded pews and the stained glass windows of our churches more than the God for whom those things were created. Our church is splintering, with certain congregations and leaders choosing to exercise a temporary disciplinary provision to disaffiliate and go either independent or to a newly emerging organization that values separation more than connection. The spirit is toxic. The attitude is confrontational. The method of invitation is filled with coercion and accusation. Words are spoken that are often vitriolic, mean-spirited, and filled with falsehoods designed to make the other side appear to be the enemy, the problem, and the reason behind everything that is wrong with the church today. And all of that has led me to say at times, why would anyone want to associate with this kind of behavior? And yet people do, because for some very odd reason, it feels comfortable, even good, because it's reflective of the culture that's emerged around us. And like an impressionable young child, we've come to believe that this is the norm rather than the gospel message of the love of God and love of neighbor, or the theology that we've embraced that calls us to embrace the core beliefs of inclusion, grace, peace, and forgiveness. And as a result, this is anything but the values embraced when one becomes a beloved community. Now, I don't know about you, but everywhere I go, every meeting I attend, every speech I deliver is among people who, when asked to describe themselves, admit that they are tired, worn out, and seriously wondering how much longer they can hang on in the midst of this toxic environment of uncertainty and anger. You know it to be true. Our conversations are dominated with disaffiliations. Did you know that the North Carolina Annual Conference is having a special session today to authenticate the disaffiliation of 33% of their congregations? See how it rolls off my tongue? We're dominated with it. Post-COVID recovery conversations, we're dominated with creating legislation related to the upcoming General Conference that has not met in regular session since 2016 and has a track record, including 2019, of doing more harm than good in building the body of Christ. It's my conviction that it's time for this denomination to do the hard work, the very hard work of pivoting the conversation, pivoting the emphasis away from where our trajectory is pointing to a conversation focused on where God is calling us to be, away from toxicity and division to a conversation about beloved community and joy in being a part of something truly life-giving and transformative, away from laws and rules and paragraphs about what it means to comply, to the hope-filled work of finally putting an achievable plan to our mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, and making a theme that we've been embarrassed to promote, open hearts, open minds, open doors, into a clarion call for full inclusion and the expression that our theology really is an open table for all, based on grace, love, hope, justice, and joy that we can not only live into, but find joy from. It's time, friends, to pivot away from what is killing us into a conversation about what Methodism's next expression should look like, and begin now to put the pieces in place to make it a reality. But make no mistake, this pivot is not only needed immediately, it's not easy to achieve. Like a drug addict or an alcoholic who loves to claim that they can control their addiction, but constantly turns back to the pill or the bottle, even the best leaders in our beloved United Methodist Church will have a hard time staying focused on not only how to make the pivot, but also proclaim the possibilities that lie ahead when we focus on the horizon that's established when that pivot is made. We must not only hold one another accountable to these critical, life-giving conversations about the next expression of Methodism, but we must seek out and nurture prophetic voices that will provide clear and compelling reasons for us to leave behind past structures, sins, and missteps, and place in our satchels once again the very things that will create a new movement based on beloved community and the integration of a relevant theology that will convincingly reach the younger generations, the marginalized, the oppressed, and in effect, anyone who is seeking a way out of the morass of the existence that we're currently living in. To close today, I would share with you a reading. Every day, I, like many of you, read from the daily meditation from Richard Rohr. The meditation from yesterday speaks directly to what I'm attempting to say to you this morning. Quoting Brian McLaren, yesterday's reading posed these interesting questions. What would it mean for us if we happened to live during the decline of the old humanity, when a new humanity is in the painful process of being born? What if the growth of the new movement, the new humanity, the new social creation or construction depends on the old one losing its hegemony? As I write these words, I can't help but feel a flood of resonances with the Hebrew scriptures. I feel echoes of Isaiah, speaking of God doing a new thing, something fresh springing forth, so that there will be good news for the poor, recovery of sight for the blind, freedom for the incarcerated and oppressed. I hear the prophet imagining a promise when weapons are recycled into farm equipment because nobody studies war anymore. I hear Ezekiel's oracle about a new heart, a heart of flesh that replaces the heart of stone. I hear Amos envisioning a time when a river of justice flows down from the heights, filling the lowest places first. I hear Micah revitalizing everything in his religion except doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God. And so, McLaren says, I imagine in the middle of the old meta movement of empires, domination, extraction, and exploitation, what if a long succession of prophets, including Mary, John the Baptizer, Jesus, Paul, and others, were giving us a vision of a new movement being born? And I would say to you, friends who are listening in on this, what would it look like if those prophets emerged from our beloved United Methodist Church that would no longer tolerate this trajectory of decline and vitriolic expression and move us into a new expression of what Methodism should be? What would it look like if we were to do the hard work of turning a rusty gear that is pointing us to a future of decline, exclusion, and exhaustion, and pivot this church we love into a new trajectory of vitality, inclusion, justice, and new life? What would it look like if our disciplinary emphasis was more focused on a book of spiritual revival and beloved community rather than a book of laws and rules that have more to alienate, exclude, and suppress the movement that made Methodism the most relevant expression of its day? What will it take for us to achieve this? It begins with a pivot away from an old, life-draining attempt to preserve what was into a life-giving possibility of what might be. I read the other day a reflection on the tomb. That reflection said, maybe it's not the darkness of a tomb which reflects death, but the darkness of a womb that houses the beginning of a new and resurrected life. Maybe the darkness we are in is not the death of a tomb, but the new life of beloved community within us waiting to be resurrected. And if we are caretakers, the midwife of a birth about to happen, our job is to help one another breathe and prepare for one another for one last push that will result in new life around us. Beloved, you are dearly loved, dear to the heart of God. Breathe and push. Breathe and push. And a new life of beloved community can and will emerge. As the hymn writer said, breathe on me, breath of God. Fill me with life anew, that I may love what thou dost love and do what thou wouldst do. Won't you join in? Let's pivot this denomination. May it be so. May it be so. Amen.